Hello, Bang family, and welcome to the Bang Podcast Network. I'm Mr. Smith, the founder of the Black Ancestry Network Group, the Bang, and now I want you to travel with me back exactly 61 years from today, to a night when a man named Ronald Reagan stood before the nation and delivered his now famous speech, A Time for Choosing. Reagan was talking about the Democratic Party on this day, warning that big government, high taxes, and distant elites could one day rob the people of their freedom. But here's the twist. Everything he feared about the Democrats then describes the Republican Party now. Now think about that. Reagan warned about those who would trade liberty for security. Today, that trade is being made in the name of law and order. He warned of an elite ruling from afar. Now that elite sits at golf resorts and travels in private jets, claiming to speak for the forgotten citizens of America. And the way that is happening should sound familiar. When a nation grows tired and fear replaces hope, and when one man rises promising to restore greatness that only he can define, history tells us what will come next. That's exactly what happened with Adolf Hitler in the 1930s Germany. He didn't begin by tearing up freedom overnight. He began by convincing good people that freedom was safer in his hands. He called this movement patriotic. He promised to make Germany great again. Reagan, for all his flaws, believed that no man, no president, no party should ever place themselves above the people. Now that is the question before us again here in 2025. So now we'll listen to Reagan's own words, the words that helped define a generation. You will be guided through those words and what they mean today, especially for the people whose freedom was never delivered. That's right, African Americans, Negroes, black folks, however you want to frame it. Because while Reagan was warning about tax burdens and government control, black Americans were facing a different kind of oppression. Police dogs in Birmingham, redlining all across America, and farm foreclosures across the South. Freedom was being preached from political podiums, but denied at lunch counters, banks, and courts. And so, before we begin, I ask you, as Reagan asked America, do we still remember the freedoms granted to us through the Constitution by the Founding Fathers? And if we do, we must protect them from those who would twist the flag of liberty into a weapon of control. And now I give you your host, Yawanna Kno.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Tonight, I want you to listen with both your ears and your memory. If you grew up during the Reagan years, or if your parents told you stories about that time, listen closely to what he says here. And if you're a part of the MAGA generation today, ask yourself, do these words sound like your movement? Or do they sound like a warning about it? What Reagan said in 1964 spoke to fear. Fear of taxes, fear of change, fear of government. But while he was talking about freedom, millions of African Americans were still fighting for the right to simply exist freely. Freedom back then didn't reach every neighborhood. Not in Selma, not in Birmingham, not in Harlem. So tonight, as we listen to Reagan's own words, we'll place them in the America he didn't describe, the one we were living in, the one where the fight for justice and equality was still being written in blood and prayer. Let's go back to October 27, 1964, when Ronald Reagan took the stage and gave America a time for choosing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you and good evening. The sponsor has been identified, but unlike most television programs, the performer hasn't been provided with a script. As a matter of fact, I have been permitted to choose my own words and discuss my own ideas regarding the choice that we face in the next few weeks. I have spent most of my life as a Democrat. I recently have seen fit to follow another course. I believe that the issues confronting us cross party lines. Now, one side in this campaign has been telling us that the issues of this election are the maintenance of peace and prosperity. The line has been used, we've never had it so good. But I have an uncomfortable feeling that this prosperity isn't something on which we can base our hopes for the future. No nation in history has ever survived a tax burden that reached a third of its national income. Today, 37 cents out of every dollar earned in this country is the tax collector's share. And yet our government continues to spend $17 million a day more than the government takes in. We haven't balanced our budget 28 out of the last 34 years. We've raised our debt limit 3 times in the last 12 months. And now our national debt is 1.5 times bigger than all the combined debts of all the nations of the world. We have $15 billion in gold in our treasury. We don't own an ounce. Foreign dollar claims are $27.3 billion. And we've just had announced that the dollar of 1939 will now purchase 45 cents in its total value. As for the peace that we would preserve, I wonder who among us would like to approach the wife or mother whose husband or son has died in South Vietnam and ask them if they think this is a peace that should be maintained indefinitely. Do they mean peace, or do they mean we just want to be left in peace? There can be no real peace while one American is dying someplace in the world for the rest of us. We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said if we lose that war, and in so doing lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent its happening. Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the founding fathers. Not too long ago, 2 friends of mine were talking to a Cuban refugee, a businessman who had escaped from Castro. And in the midst of his story, one of my friends turned to the other and said, "We don't know how lucky we are." And the Cuban stopped and said, "How lucky you are. I had some place to escape to." And in that sentence, he told us the entire story. If we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and the most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan our lives for us better than we can plan them ourselves. You and I are told increasingly we have to choose between a left or right. Well, I'd like to suggest there is no such thing as a left or right. There's only an up or down. Man's old age dream, the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. And regardless of their sincerity, their humanitarian motives, those who would trade our freedom for security have embarked on this downward course.
What you just heard was Ronald Reagan at the dawn of his political life, a time when America was balancing on 2 edges of history. One edge was the Cold War, the other was the Civil Rights Movement. While Reagan warned of foreign enemies and big government, millions of African Americans were fighting enemies at home, sheriffs, banks, and legislatures that believed the words liberty and justice for all came with an asterisk. In 1964, the year of this speech, black sharecroppers in Mississippi were still being evicted for registering to vote. Fannie Lou Hamer was testifying about being beaten nearly to death for daring to speak at the Democratic Convention. And when Reagan said, "We've never had it so good," he was speaking from a world most black Americans couldn't enter. Reagan spoke of prosperity, but black farmers were losing land faster than any group in the nation. The U.S. Department of Agriculture was quietly approving loans for white farmers while denying them to black ones. That quiet theft would cost our community more than 12 million acres by the 1980s. And it hasn't stopped. Today, under Republican leadership, the same bureaucracies Reagan claimed to distrust are still blocking aid, still forcing foreclosures, and still branding black agriculture as unprofitable. When Reagan complained about government housing and spending, redlined neighborhoods were already forming, not by accident, but by design. Federal housing maps colored black communities in red ink, declaring them too risky for loans. That is how the ghettos were born. Not from laziness, but from legislation. Reagan never mentioned that, because for all his eloquence about freedom, his version rarely reached our doorsteps. And now, 60 years later, the same party that calls itself Reagan's heir is repeating his warnings in reverse. They blame the poor, mock the protester, and protect the powerful. They claim to fight socialism, yet cheer when government agents tear-gas citizens on American soil. They cry freedom, yet work to control women's bodies, erase black history, and intimidate voters. Reagan told Americans, there is no left or right, only up or down. If he were here today, watching armed men storm a Capitol and threaten his own republic, he might realize that we have indeed gone down, not into socialism, but into something much darker, authoritarian nationalism draped in the flag. So as you listen to the rest of Reagan's speech tonight, I want you to ask yourself, who are the people today doing the very thing he warned against? Who are the ones promising safety by silencing dissent? Who are the ones saying, only I can fix it? And more importantly, what happens when they turn that power toward the same people Reagan's America left behind?
In this vote harvesting time, they use terms like the Great Society, or as we were told a few days ago by the President, we must accept a greater government activity in the affairs of the people. But they've been a little more explicit in the past, and among themselves, and all of the things I now will quote have appeared in print. These are not Republican accusations. For example, they have voices that say the Cold War will end through our acceptance of a not undemocratic socialism. Another voice says the profit motive has become outmoded. It must be replaced by the incentives of the welfare state. Or our traditional system of individual freedom is incapable of solving the complex problems of the 20th century. Senator Fulbright has said at Stanford University that the Constitution is outmoded. He referred to the President as our moral teacher and our leader. And he says he is hobbled in his task by the restrictions of power imposed on him by this antiquated document. He must be freed so that he can do for us what he knows is best. And Senator Clark of Pennsylvania, another articulate spokesman, defines liberalism as meeting the material needs of the masses through the full power of centralized government. Well, I, for one, resent it when a representative of the people refers to you and me, the free men and women of this country, as the masses. This is a term we haven't applied to ourselves in America. But beyond that, the full power of centralized government, this was the very thing the Founding Fathers sought to minimize. They knew that governments don't control things. A government can't control the economy without controlling people. And they know when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose.
Reagan's warning about force and coercion sounds prophetic, but the question we have to ask is, who actually felt that force? Because while Reagan feared a government growing too powerful over free enterprise, Black America was already living under the weight of a government powerful enough to decide where you could live, how much you could earn, and whether your children could attend a decent school. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs promised to fight poverty and expand opportunity. And for a brief moment, they worked until the backlash came. Funds meant to rebuild black neighborhoods or reroute it through white-controlled city boards. Urban renewal projects bulldozed homes in the name of progress, leaving families with nowhere to go. That's how urban renewal became what James Baldwin called Negro removal. Reagan said he resented being called one of the masses, but black citizens were literally treated as such, counted, categorized, and controlled through housing policy, education funding, and criminal codes that defined us as a social problem to be managed. He claimed, a government can't control the economy without controlling people. Yet during his own presidency 2 decades later, his administration did just that. By cutting federal farm supports, even as black farmers were still fighting USDA discrimination suits. By slashing housing aid while redlining remained unpunished. And by fueling the war on drugs, which used literal force and coercion against poor black neighborhoods. So when Reagan warned about tyranny through economic control, he might have looked closer to home. Because the kind of control he feared, police control, financial control, surveillance, and selective enforcement, was already shaping black life, and it continues today. Fast forward to 2025. When a president claims he can do whatever he wants with the Department of Justice, when governors threaten to deploy troops against peaceful protesters, when politicians write laws that silence classroom discussion of race. That is the force and coercion Reagan described. But it's not coming from liberals, it's coming from his own party's descendants. Reagan believed central power should never silence the citizen. Yet Trump's movement thrives on silencing. Teachers silenced, voters purged, journalists attacked, even elected officials are threatened for telling the truth. That's not conservative. That's coercion wearing a flag pin. And the same fear that drove white America to vote for law and order in the 60s is being rekindled today, except this time, it's weaponized against truth itself. Reagan closed this section by saying, "They knew governments don't control things." Maybe so. But governments can certainly destroy them. Land, homes, trust, hope. And every time a nation forgets that, it repeats the same harvest Reagan was trying to warn us about.
They also knew, those founding fathers, that outside of its legitimate functions, government does nothing as well or as economically as the private sector of the economy. Now, we have no better example of this than government's involvement in the farm economy over the last 30 years. Since 1955, the cost of this program has nearly doubled. 1/4 of farming in America is responsible for 85% of the farm surplus. 3/4 of farming is out on the free market and has known a 21% increase in the per capita consumption of all its produce. You see, that 1/4 of farming, that's regulated and controlled by the federal government. In the last 3 years, we've spent $43 in the feed grain program for every dollar bushel of corn we don't grow. Senator Humphrey last week charged that Barry Goldwater, as president, would seek to eliminate farmers. He should do his homework a little better, because he'll find out that we've had a decline of 5 million in the farm population under these government programs. He'll also find that the Democratic administration has sought to get from Congress extension of the farm program to include that 3/4 that is now free. He'll find that they've also asked for the right to imprison farmers who wouldn't keep books as prescribed by the federal government. The Secretary of Agriculture asked for the right to seize farms through condemnation and resell them to other individuals. And contained in that same program was a provision that would have allowed the federal government to remove 2 million farmers from the soil. At the same time, there's been an increase in the Department of Agriculture employees. There's now 1 for every 30 farms in the United States. And still, they can't tell us how 66 shiploads of grain headed for Austria disappeared without a trace, and Billy Sol Estes never left shore. Every responsible farmer and farm organization has repeatedly asked the government to free the farm economy. But who are farmers to know what's best for them? The wheat farmers voted against a wheat program. The government passed it anyway. Now the price of bread goes up, the price of wheat to the farmer goes down.
When Reagan spoke those words in 1964, he was defending the independent farmer, warning that Washington was taking too much control of the land. But for black farmers, government control had a different meaning. Since Reconstruction, black families who farmed their own land had to fight for loans, equipment, and insurance that white farmers received by default. By the 1950s and 60s, the very years Reagan called the golden age of American farming, federal county offices routinely denied black applications or approved them too late for harvest. So while Reagan worried that the federal government might imprison farmers for not keeping books as prescribed, our people were already imprisoned by debt, by foreclosure, and by a system that used policy as a whip. He said government does nothing, as well as the private sector. Well, the private sector of agriculture was run by banks that wouldn't lend to black farmers and co-ops that wouldn't buy our produce. Private meant powerful, public meant political, and black farmers were caught between both. Fast forward to today, the USDA discrimination lawsuits of the 1990s and 2000s, Pickford 1 and 2, proved what Reagan never mentioned, that government offices deliberately blocked tens of thousands of black farmers from aid. And in 2025, some of those same families are still waiting for justice. So when Reagan said, "Free the farm economy," what he didn't see was that freedom without fairness is just another form of control. Because you can't free a market built on exclusion. You can only change who gets locked out. And look around now, from Georgia to Texas to Iowa. Small farmers of every color are fighting corporate agribusinesses that receive the very subsidies Reagan criticized. The difference is, those corporations don't march for relief. They write the laws. When Reagan spoke of a government too large to answer to the people, he was half right. But today, the danger is a government shrunk to serve only the few, a state captured by billion-dollar donors and self-proclaimed kings. Reagan ended that section by warning that when government interferes, the price of bread goes up. The price of wheat to the farmer goes down. In Black America, the price of freedom has always gone up, and the value of our labor has always been pushed down. That's not just history. That's harvest time, and the fields are still unequal.
Meanwhile, back in the city, under urban renewal, the assault on freedom carries on. Private property rights so diluted that public interest is almost anything a few government planners decide it should be. In a program that takes from the needy and gives to the greedy, we see such spectacles as in Cleveland, Ohio, $1.5 million building completed only 3 years ago must be destroyed to make way for what government officials call a more compatible use of the land. The president tells us he's now going to start building public housing units in the thousands, where heretofore we've only built them in the hundreds. But FHA and the Veterans Administration tell us they have 120,000 housing units they've taken back through mortgage foreclosure. For 3 decades, we've sought to solve the problems of unemployment through government planning, and the more the plans fail, the more the planners plan. The latest is the Area Redevelopment Agency. They've just declared Rice County, Kansas, a depressed area. Rice County, Kansas has 200 oil wells, and the 14,000 people there have over $30 million on deposit in personal savings in their banks. When the government tells you you're depressed, lie down and be depressed. We have so many people who can't see a fat man standing beside a thin one without coming to the conclusion the fat man got that way by taking advantage of the thin one. So they're going to solve all the problems of human misery through government and government planning. Well, now, if government planning and welfare had the answer, and they've had almost 30 years of it, shouldn't we expect government to read the score to us once in a while? Shouldn't they be telling us about the decline each year in the number of people needing help, the reduction in the need for public housing? But the reverse is true. Each year the need grows greater, the program grows greater. We were told 4 years ago that 17 million people went to bed hungry each night. Well, that was probably true. They were all on a diet. But now we're told that 9.3 million families in this country are poverty-stricken on the basis of earning less than $3,000 a year. Welfare spending 10 times greater than it was in the dark depths of the Depression. We're spending $45 billion on welfare. Now do a little arithmetic and you'll find that if we divided the $45 billion up equally among those 9 million poor families, we'd be able to give each family $4,600 a year. And this, added to their present income, should eliminate poverty. Direct aid to the poor, however, is only running about $600 per family. It would seem that someplace there must be some overhead. Now, So now we declare war on poverty, or you too can be a Bobby Baker. Now, do they honestly expect us to believe that if we add $1 billion to the $45 billion we're spending, one more program to the 30-odd we have, and remember this new program doesn't replace any, it just duplicates existing programs, do they believe that poverty is suddenly going to disappear by magic?
Reagan called it an assault on freedom. He was right, but not in the way he thought. Because while he imagined bureaucrats bulldozing property in the name of progress, Black Americans were the ones watching their homes, businesses, and churches literally bulldozed under the banner of urban renewal. Federal planners redlined our neighborhoods, then labeled them blighted, so they could seize the land and sell it cheap to developers who looked nothing like the people who lived there. From Detroit to Atlanta, New Orleans to Cleveland, entire Black communities were erased so that freeways, stadiums, and corporate towers could rise. They called it progress. We called it displacement. Reagan mocked a $1.5 million building destroyed for a more compatible use of the land. He never mentioned the Black business districts that were flattened to make way for those compatible uses. In Cleveland and every other city, those decisions were signed off by city boards and federal banks that refused Black residents any voice in the matter. When Reagan complained that government planning takes from the needy and gives to the greedy, he missed the fact that the greedy were already in the planning rooms. Real estate speculators, corporate builders, and banks grew rich off federal funds meant for poverty relief. That's how the word ghetto entered the American vocabulary. Not as a natural accident of poverty, but as the product of government maps, mortgage rules, and segregation by design. He laughed about the war on poverty, but for Black people, the war was poverty, and the enemy wore a suit and held a clipboard. Reagan framed the problem as too many plans. The real problem was that those plans never included us. He said, welfare spending 10 times greater than in the Depression. Yes, but by 1964, the majority of Black families still lived below the poverty line, locked out of union jobs, college loans, and fair mortgages. And when poverty programs did finally reach our communities, they came with strings attached, control over how we organized, who we voted for, even what we taught our children. Now fast forward to 2025. Look around at what Reagan feared, a central authority deciding who deserves help and who doesn't. It's here again, but it doesn't call itself socialism. It calls itself America First. It shuts down affordable housing, cuts food assistance, and scolds the poor for being poor, all while handing tax breaks to the billionaires who own our apartment complexes. Reagan warned that the more the plans fail, the more the planners plan. But what we see today is worse. The fewer the plans, the more the powerful profit. And so, family, as we move to the next section of Reagan's speech, remember this. The policies he attacked in the 1960s were the same policies that helped Black families survive. The policies he praised later in the 1980s, mass privatization, cut taxes, cut social services, are the ones that deepened the divide he claimed to fear. So ask yourself, as we listen to the next part of his speech, was Reagan really warning us about Democrats, or was he prophesying what his own party would become?
Well, in all fairness, I should explain there is one part of the new program that isn't duplicated. This is the youth feature. We're now going to solve the dropout problem, juvenile delinquency, by reinstituting something like the old CCC camps. And we're going to put our young people in these camps. But again, we do some arithmetic and we find that we're going to spend each year just on room and board for each young person we help, $4,700 a year. We can send them to Harvard for $2,700. Of course, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting Harvard is the answer to juvenile delinquency. But seriously, what are we doing to those we seek to help? Not too long ago, a judge called me here in Los Angeles. He told me that a young woman who'd come before him for a divorce. She had 6 children, was pregnant with her 7th. Under his questioning, she revealed her husband was a laborer earning $250 a month. She wanted the divorce to get an $80 raise. She's eligible for $330 a month in the Aid to Dependent Children program. She got the idea from 2 women in her neighborhood who'd already done that very thing. Yet any time you and I question the schemes of the do-gooders, we're denounced as being against their humanitarian goals. They say we're always against things, we're never for anything. Well, the trouble with our liberal friends is not that they're ignorant, it's just that they know so much that isn't so. Now, we're for a provision that destitution should not follow unemployment by reason of old age. And to that end, we've accepted Social Security as a step toward meeting the problem. But we're against those entrusted with this program when they practice deception regarding its fiscal shortcomings, when they charge that any criticism of the program means that we want to end payments to those people who depend on them for a livelihood. They've called it insurance to us in 100 million pieces of literature. But then they appeared before the Supreme Court and they testified it was a welfare program. They only used the term insurance to sell it to the people. And they said Social Security dues are a tax for the general use of the government. And the government has used that tax. There is no fund. Because Robert Byers, the actuarial head, appeared before a congressional committee and admitted that Social Security as of this moment is $298 billion in the hole. But he said there should be no cause for worry, because as long as they had the power to tax, they could always take away from the people whatever they needed to bail them out of trouble. And they're doing just that. A young man, 21 years of age, working at an average salary, his Social Security contribution would in the open market buy him an insurance policy that would guarantee $220 a month at age 65. The government promises $127. He could live it up until he's 31 and then take out a policy that would pay more than Social Security. Now, are we so lacking in business sense that we can't put this program on a sound basis so that people who do require those payments will find they can get them when they're due, that the cupboard isn't bare? Barry Goldwater thinks we can. At the same time, can't we introduce voluntary features that would permit a citizen who can do better on his own to be excused upon presentation of evidence that he had made provision for the non-earning years? Should we not allow a widow with children to work and not lose the benefits supposedly paid for by her deceased husband? Shouldn't you and I be allowed to declare who our beneficiaries will be under this program, which we cannot do? I think we're for telling our senior citizens that no one in this country should be denied medical care because of a lack of funds. But I think we're against forcing all citizens, regardless of need, into a compulsory government program, especially when we have such examples as was announced last week when France admitted that their Medicare program is now bankrupt. They've come to the end of the road.
Keep in mind that when Reagan talks about poverty, he's talking about black people. Reagan said the problem was government waste, that we could send a dropout to Harvard for less than a youth camp bunk bed. But let's pause and ask, who were those young people being helped? In 1964, most of the youth Reagan wanted to discipline came from the same neighborhoods redlined into poverty. When he spoke of juvenile delinquency, he was talking about the sons of black families who'd been pushed into overcrowded housing, underfunded schools, and police surveillance zones. So when the government said it would put them in camps, it didn't sound like charity, it sounded like containment. And when Reagan joked that Social Security was a welfare program, he left out the truth that for decades, black domestic and agricultural workers were barred from Social Security altogether. Our grandparents paid taxes that never counted toward their retirement. So while Reagan painted Washington as the villain stealing from workers, the real theft had already happened. It was built into the system's design. He accused the government of deception, saying there was no fund. But look at what happened later. Under his own presidency, the surplus generated by payroll taxes was quietly diverted to cover federal deficits from tax cuts for the rich and military spending. The cupboard he warned would be bare. He helped empty. Reagan liked to say we should let citizens who can do better on their own opt out. Yet for black Americans, that was never an option. We weren't invited into the same markets or wages that could buy private security for old age. Our safety net was Social Security and Medicare and public health clinics. To opt out was to go without. Today, in 2025, the same rhetoric has returned, just louder. We hear leaders on the right calling to cut Social Security, privatize Medicare, and end food assistance, all while handing billion-dollar subsidies to corporations. They use Reagan's words, freedom from government, to defend policies that free only the wealthy from accountability. Reagan said, no one should be denied medical care because of lack of funds. But look at the states still refusing to expand Medicaid, where hospitals close and mothers die in childbirth because care is treated as a privilege, not a right. Those aren't liberal experiments, they're conservative realities. So yes, Reagan feared a bankrupt system. But what truly bankrupts a nation isn't money, it's moral neglect. The same neglect that left black farmers landless, black elders uncovered, and black neighborhoods uninsured. If the cupboard is bare, it's because those who took the loaf now call themselves saviors. Next, we'll hear Reagan turn from economics to principle, the idea of freedom itself. And we'll ask whether that word still means the same thing when some Americans are never free to begin with.
Road. In addition, was Barry Goldwater so irresponsible when he suggested that our government give up its program of deliberate planned inflation so that when you do get your Social Security pension, $1 will buy $1's worth and not 45 cents worth? I think we're for an international organization where the nations of the world can seek peace. But I think we're against subordinating American interests to an organization that has become so structurally unsound that today you can muster a 2/3 vote on the floor of the General Assembly among nations that represent less than 10% of the world's population. I think we're against the hypocrisy of assailing our allies because here and there they cling to a colony, while we engage in a conspiracy of silence and never open our mouths about the millions of people enslaved in the Soviet colonies in the satellite nations. I think we're for aiding our allies by sharing of our material blessings with those nations which share in our fundamental beliefs. But we're against doling out money government to government, creating bureaucracy, if not socialism, all over the world. We set out to help 19 countries. We're helping 107. We've spent $146 billion. With that money, we bought a $2 million yacht for Haile Selassie. We bought dress suits for Greek undertakers, extra wives for Kenya government officials. We bought 1,000 TV sets for a place where they have no electricity. In the last 6 years, 52 nations have bought $7 billion worth of our gold, and all 52 are receiving foreign aid from this country. No government ever voluntarily reduces itself in size, so government programs once launched never disappear. Actually, a government bureau is the nearest thing to eternal life we'll ever see on this earth. Federal employees number 2.5 million, and federal, state, and local, 1 out of 6 of the nation's workforce employed by government. These proliferating bureaus with their thousands of regulations have cost us many of our constitutional safeguards. How many of us realize that today federal agents can invade a man's property without a warrant? They can impose a fine without a formal hearing, let alone a trial by jury, and they can seize and sell his property at auction to enforce the payment of that fine. In Chico County, Arkansas, James Weir overplanted his rice allotment. The government obtained a $17,000 judgment, and a U.S. Marshal sold his 960-acre farm at auction. The government said it was necessary as a warning to others to make the system work. Last February 19th at the University of Minnesota, Norman Thomas, 6 times candidate for president on the Socialist Party ticket, said if Barry Goldwater became president, he would stop the advance of socialism in the United States. I think that's exactly what he will do. But as a former Democrat, I can tell you Norman Thomas isn't the only man who has drawn this parallel to socialism with the present administration. Because back in 1936, Mr. Democrat himself, Al Smith, a great American, came before the American people and charged that the leadership of his party was taking the party of Jefferson, Jackson, and Cleveland down the road under the banners of Marx, Lenin, and Stalin. And he walked away from his party and he never returned till the day he died. Because to this day, the leadership of that party has been taking that party, that honorable party, down the road in the image of the Labor Socialist Party of England. Now, it doesn't require expropriation or confiscation of private property or business to impose socialism on a people. What does it mean whether you hold the deed to or the title to your business or property if the government holds the power of life and death over that business or property? And such machinery already exists. The government can find some charge to bring against any concern it chooses to prosecute. The government can find some charge to bring against any concern it chooses to prosecute. The government can find some charge to bring against any concern it chooses to prosecute. Every businessman has his own tale of harassment. Somewhere a perversion has taken place.
Reagan said a perversion had taken place, that government was growing too strong, that socialism was creeping in. But what was really happening? Black citizens were just beginning to taste the first crumbs of democracy. The Civil Rights Act had only been signed 3 months before this speech, and the same federal machinery Reagan condemned was for the first time being used to enforce equal rights, to desegregate schools, protect voting, and investigate racist violence. So when Reagan warned about federal agents invading a man's property, many of those agents were actually confronting sheriffs who refused to integrate, or governors blocking black children from classrooms. The tyranny he described sounded very different depending on which side of freedom you were standing on. He railed against planned inflation and foreign aid, but ignored that the greatest theft of value wasn't overseas, it was here at home. The steady inflation of white wealth and the deflation of black opportunity. From the GI Bill to FHA loans, the government Reagan distrusted had already chosen winners, and we weren't among them. Then he said, every businessman has his own tale of harassment. True, but try being a black entrepreneur in the 1960s. Banks wouldn't lend, zoning boards blocked permits, police raided stores under false pretense. The machinery of harassment was not bureaucratic red tape, it was Jim Crow in a three-piece suit. Reagan framed his battle as one against socialism. But look at what replaced it: corporate feudalism. Today, power is no longer centralized in Washington bureaucrats. It's concentrated in boardrooms, super PACs, and political dynasties. We traded public planning for private dominance. And the result is the same loss of freedom Reagan feared, only now it's sold under his name. He said, no government ever voluntarily reduces itself in size. He was right, but neither do billion-dollar monopolies or political cults that worship a single man. And in 2025, that's where we stand. A movement claiming Reagan's legacy while dismantling his principles, attacking allies, rejecting global cooperation, and excusing dictators because they love America's strongman. Reagan said socialism could come without expropriation. He was warning that control can exist even if you still hold the deed. And that's exactly what's happening now. Control over minds, over media, over truth itself. We still have our ballots, our voices, our platforms, but each is being boxed in by laws, lies, and intimidation. So yes, somewhere a perversion has taken place, but not the one Reagan imagined. It isn't socialism that threatens freedom today. It's fascism wrapped in patriotism, thriving inside the very party that once crowned him its saint.
Our natural unalienable rights are now considered to be a dispensation of government, and freedom has never been so fragile, so close to slipping from our grasp as it is at this moment. Our Democratic opponents seem unwilling to debate these issues. They want to make you and I believe that this is a contest between two men, that we're to choose just between two personalities. Well, what of this man that they would destroy? And in destroying, they would destroy that which he represents, the ideas that you and I hold dear. Is he the brash and shallow and trigger-happy man they say he is? Well, I've been privileged to know him when. I knew him long before he ever dreamed of trying for high office. And I can tell you personally, I've never known a man in my life I believed so incapable of doing a dishonest or dishonorable thing. This is a man who in his own business, before he entered politics, instituted a profit-sharing plan before unions had ever thought of it. He put in health and medical insurance for all his employees. He took 50% of the profits before taxes and set up a retirement program, a pension plan for all his employees. He sent monthly checks for life to an employee who was ill and couldn't work. He provides nursing care for the children of mothers who work in the stores. When Mexico was ravaged by the floods in the Rio Grande, he climbed in his airplane and flew medicine and supplies down there. An ex-GI told me how he met him. It was the week before Christmas during the Korean War, and he was at the Los Angeles airport trying to get a ride home to Arizona for Christmas. And he said that a lot of servicemen there and no seats available on the planes. And then a voice came over the loudspeaker and said, any men in uniform wanting a ride to Arizona, go to runway such and such. And they went down there. There was a fellow named Barry Goldwater sitting in his plane. Every day in those weeks before Christmas, all day long, he'd load up the plane, fly it to Arizona, fly them to their homes, fly back over to get another load. During the hectic split-second timing of a campaign, this is a man who took time out to sit beside an old friend who was dying of cancer. His campaign managers were understandably impatient, but he said there aren't many left who care what happens to her. I'd like her to know I care. This is a man who said to his 19-year-old son, there is no foundation like the rock of honesty and fairness. And when you begin to build your life on that rock, with the cement of the faith in God that you have, then you have a real start. This is not a man who could carelessly send other people's sons to war. And that is the issue of this campaign that makes all the other problems I've discussed academic, unless we realize we're in a war that must be won. Those who would trade our freedom for the soup kitchen of the welfare state have told us they have a utopian solution of peace without victory. They call their policy accommodation. And they say if we'll only avoid any direct confrontation with the enemy, he'll forget his evil ways and learn to love us. All who oppose them are indicted as warmongers. They say we offer simple answers to complex problems. Well, perhaps there is a simple answer. Not an easy answer, but simple.
Reagan said, freedom has never been so fragile. He meant the Cold War, but for millions of Black Americans, freedom had always been fragile. Just months before this speech, civil rights workers were murdered in Mississippi, churches were bombed, and the Voting Rights Act was still a dream. While Reagan praised Barry Goldwater as a man of honor, it was Goldwater who opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, calling it government overreach. To Reagan, the fight was about government versus liberty. To us, it was about government finally enforcing liberty. He said our unalienable rights were becoming a dispensation of government. But without government intervention, those rights remained alienated from us entirely. The right to vote, to own property, to attend school, all required federal protection because local power refused to yield. And listen carefully. Reagan insisted that those who would trade freedom for the soup kitchen of the welfare state were betraying America. Yet for Black families denied access to fair wages and housing, that soup kitchen was sometimes the only safety net left after centuries of exclusion. Reagan framed compassion as dependence. We saw it as survival. He lifted up Barry Goldwater as an honest man who wouldn't send other people's sons to war. But Black sons were already at war. In Vietnam abroad and in Birmingham at home, drafted to fight for a freedom they still couldn't fully claim. Reagan's rhetoric of rugged individualism inspired millions, but it also excused the nation from collective responsibility. When he warned that freedom was slipping away, he never mentioned whose hands were prying it loose. Fast forward to 2025. The same cry of freedom is now used to resist masks, to ban books, to silence teachers, to strip women and minorities of choice. The same distrust of big government fuels laws that gerrymander, censor, and criminalize protest. Reagan feared socialism's hand on the lever. What we face now is fascism's grip on the steering wheel. So yes, freedom is fragile, but not because of welfare checks or public schools. It's fragile when truth becomes treason, when empathy is mocked as weakness, when citizens stop caring who loses liberty as long as they keep theirs. As Reagan closes his speech, remember, he believed Americans could still choose the higher road. The question now is, do we still know the way?
If you and I have the courage to tell our elected officials that we want our national policy based on what we know in our hearts is morally right, we cannot buy our security, our freedom from the threat of the bomb, by committing an immorality so great as saying to 1 billion human beings now enslaved behind the Iron Curtain, give up your dreams of freedom, because to save our own skins, we're willing to make a deal with your slave masters. Alexander Hamilton said, a nation which can prefer disgrace to danger is prepared for a master and deserves one. Now let's set the record straight. There's no argument over the choice between peace and war, but there's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second: surrender. Admittedly, there's a risk in any course we follow other than this, but every lesson of history tells us that the greater risk lies in appeasement. And this is the specter our well-meaning liberal friends refuse to face, that their policy of accommodation is appeasement. And it gives no choice between peace and war, only between fight or surrender. If we continue to accommodate, continue to back and retreat, eventually we have to face the final demand, the ultimatum. And what then? Well, Nikita Khrushchev has told his people he knows what our answer will be. He has told them that we're retreating under the pressure of the Cold War, and someday, when the time comes to deliver the final ultimatum, our surrender will be voluntary, because by that time, we will have been weakened from within spiritually, morally, and economically. He believes this because from our side he's heard voices pleading for peace at any price, or better read than dead, or as one commentator put it, he'd rather live on his knees than die on his feet. And therein lies the road to war, because those voices don't speak for the rest of us. You and I know and do not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? Just in the face of this enemy? Or should Moses have told the children of Israel to live in slavery under the Pharaohs? Should Christ have refused the cross? Should the patriots at Concord Bridge have thrown down their guns and refused to fire the shot heard round the world? The martyrs of history were not fools. And our honored dead, who gave their lives to stop the advance of the Nazis, didn't die in vain. Where then is the road to peace? Well, it's a simple answer after all. You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance.
Hear me now. This is the part people try to skip. For more than 150 years, whole swaths of America watched, and often did nothing, while black life was made cheap. When the KKK marched and murdered, did you always say something? When lynchings were justified by tradition, did you stand and shout them down? When federal agencies and local police were infiltrated, when power colluded with terror, did the average citizen interrupt that course? Too often the answer was no. Look closer. The destruction of black communities wasn't accidental. Drugs flowed into neighborhoods that had been engineered into poverty. Redlining boxed people into places without credit, without schools, without opportunity. Families lost farms and homes, while bankers and speculators counted the profit. Those were not random failures. They were policy and profit wearing different hats. And when black people finally used their voices, when Colin Kaepernick kneeled to call attention to brutality, many of you cheered at his punishment. When George Floyd cried, "I can't breathe," when Breonna Taylor was slaughtered in her bed, when so many black men and women died under gun and badge, did you demand accountability fast enough? Or did you wait until a camera made it undeniable? We are not quiet because we don't care. We are quiet because we have been made the front line, placed where the bullets, the margins, and the poverty hit first. This is not our fight alone. It is not Black America's duty to carry the burden of saving the Republic while others refuse to fix what they broke. You believed, in some quiet corner, that a strong man could save what you helped to ruin. You were comfortable in the cruel systems you inherited, and then wondered why someone promising rhetoric, not restitution, would be followed. So here is the hard, simple truth. If you put Black people on the front lines and expect them to hold the line for a nation that refused to defend them for generations, you are asking them to die for your convenience. If you fail to act, to demand justice, to dismantle the systems that made these wounds, we all lose. Not they lose, we lose, every one of us, because a country that permits cruelty to be normalized cannot long remain free for anyone. If you want courage, it won't come from cheering on cruelty or nostalgia. It comes from choosing justice when it's costly, from defending the dignity of the least among us when it's unpopular, from refusing to be comforted by lies. So watch the tape, watch the Humanist Report pieces, watch the footage of families torn apart, and ask yourself, when the next moral choice comes, will you be the one who stood silent or the one who stood up? This was Yawanna Kno on the BANG podcast, Mr. Smith. Thank you for the platform. Listeners, your rendezvous with destiny is not a slogan. It is a summons to act. It's your time. Stand against the power like so many African Americans have, and face the fury and wrath of those who do not want to see you rise. I know that hurt. I've lived through that pain, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. To be rejected in America by the people and the government you once believed in. Yawanna Kno, signing out.